go ahead and get started. Good evening. It is so great to see so many faces here, people, students, current students, our speakers, and maybe former students, and community members. And I want to recognize the provost is here. It's wonderful that you're here, as well as Sandra from the college office. My name is Josh Mizell. I'm the chair of the Department of Sociology. And I'm really excited about this talk. I'm not going to introduce our speakers. Instead, I'm going to introduce my colleague and program leader for the Cannabis Studies program. Dominic Corva and I have worked, and Dominic's going to be introducing our speakers. I've known Dominic for 12 years or so now. 14. Okay, all right, I'll take your word for it. 14.
The inaugural
It
talk
feels
was
like
2012.
12, but it's been 14.
Just remember to when Himmer had its first talk.
So for 14 years, 12 to 14 years ago, we met when Himmer, the Humboldt Institute for Interdisciplinary Marijuana Research, that I helped co-found in 2010, we had an inaugural speaker series. And we actually did this for a couple of years, and we have upwards of 100 people that would show up, and maybe we're on our way to kind of revitalizing that speaker series. So it's great to see so many folks here. And Dominic was our inaugural speaker, and we stayed in touch over the years and got together. When was this? Maybe 2018, and said, let's co-author a handbook. Why not? And so what came from that is the Routledge Handbook for Post-Prohibition Cannabis Research. And it brought us to actually us tapping in collaboratively to a lot of folks that we've worked with over the years. And I remembered Michelle Newhart, because Michelle and I had met 4 years prior, I believe, when I was on sabbatical, and I was working on a grant with Michelle and somebody else from the state of Colorado. And so it's always wonderful to see, welcome. It's always wonderful to see the ways in which kind of different networks overlap. And from these collaborations, we then went on to develop the Cannabis Studies majors, as many of you in this room know. One of the lessons from me, and that I want to share with you, is it's really important, it is really important to have good collaborators. I found this with my professional work, with my writing, with the program work. It's important for you, especially for those of you that are students and you're thinking about starting your careers, having people that you can collaborate with, share ideas, write with, build structure. It moves projects forward in really effective ways. And so I'm very appreciative of that with Dominic, his energy and his enthusiasm, his expertise, and the ways in which that we've been able to bring together our different strengths. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Dominic Corva, the program leader for Cannabis Studies.
Thank you, Josh. William, Michelle, I am so grateful to have these two here, not just tonight, but these two people have been collaborating with us and helping build the Cannabis Studies program. There's so much that they're doing that I want you guys to know about, because they're a part of this program. They're lecturers in the program, but they are also curriculum developers in the program. We are working on a suite of medical cannabis classes that we can offer here, and part of the program change proposal that we'll be putting in this year. And we owe it to their expertise that we have them, and we hope that they'll be teaching them as well. So William Dolphin and Michelle Newhart are not just your normal sort of speaker, they're also speaking tonight on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. As a practice, I ask my students, what is your relationship with cannabis? And I start by saying something very simple, which is that I didn't always realize it was the case, but since my 20s, I have used cannabis to manage anxiety and depression. And I've worked with antidepressants and other things, but in terms of side effects and the ability to just manage daily stress, it's been very important to me. While at the same time, of course, we're operating in a post-prohibition context, where a lot of the ideas about cannabis and mental health say the opposite, right? In fact, the largest survey to date, Michelle Sexton and Lori Mishley's cannabis use survey from about 10 years ago, about 80% of people, when they're asked to report why do you use cannabis, managing anxiety and depression is right near the top. So we have this understanding of ourselves that is clashing with the dominant mental health paradigm. And I'm just so excited to have Michelle and William here to tell you about it and to give you their take from their research. They are probably best known for the book Medicalization of Marijuana. I'm trying not to look at it actually. Stigma, Legitimacy, and Patient
Experience.
Oh, I almost got it.
You were there. You were there.
It's a long one. I'm also working on shortening my titles.
Right.
We'll work on
That's something happens exactly. But it's an awesome book, and I recommend that everybody read it and check it out. But for now, I would love to get them going on their talk. So everybody welcome William and Michelle. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming out tonight. One thing that wasn't mentioned in all of that, we were collaborators and we are married. So sometimes it leads places you never imagined it would go. To find your collaborators. But
Must have been a really good team project.
exactly, right? So we're here tonight to talk about cannabis and mental health, the paradox. And I want to start off also by welcoming you to join in to a Q&A. So we do have a live Q&A here. I'm going to show you the QR code, or if you were on a computer, you could also enter the code on your computer, or you can scan the QR code. And this is going to collect in this little sidebar here. We're going to hide it while we're speaking. But if questions come up as we're going along, feel free to go ahead and put your question in. And when we get to the Q&A part, you're, of course, welcome to just ask your question the old-fashioned way. But if you put it in there and we're not getting questions from the audience, we'll look at what comments came up during this session so that we can grab those questions. Did everybody who wanted to get the QR code scanned so I can move on? All right.
I'll answer the question that came in. I believe it is being recorded.
Okay.
That's correct.
So, all right. So, the great place to start with this is, what is the paradox of cannabis and mental health? And Dominic touched on that a little bit in his introduction, but essentially, laypersons, our average person on the street, whether it's a medical user or a recreational user, who uses cannabis, tends to report that cannabis helps to manage mental health. And yet, psychiatry generally says cannabis is dangerous to your mental health. And so this is the paradox that we're talking about tonight. We're not talking about individual experiences. We're doing social science here, so we're talking about the big picture. How did we get here where an entire discipline, for the most part, represents cannabis as dangerous to your mental health? So dangerous that it cannot be used in many contexts in order to treat you, and yet the average person who reports this says that they're using it to help with mental health issues. So first, let's talk a little bit about how people report this. So one thing is that millions of people use cannabis for mental health. And about half of those surveyed say they use cannabis to manage their mental health, most commonly for anxiety and depression, but we see a whole host of reasons that people use it that kind of span all the DSM different categories of mental health problems that you can have. And we also know that, so this is from a study from International Cannabis Policy Study from 2018. There's about 8,000 people in this study in US and Canada. And we know that people also use it for physical pain and other conditions that are interrelated with mental health. And so they report, there's an interrelationship between if you have problems sleeping, not surprisingly, of pain, you get migraines. You may also be saying that you are depressed or anxious because those things are all part of a constellation of symptoms that you're experiencing that are interconnecting physical and mental health. In fact, if we look across all the English-speaking developed countries, we see that the top 3 reasons reported among all kinds of surveys within those countries tend to put mental health in their top 3. Sometimes more than one of their top 3 is related to mental health. So we got to thinking about this problem, and we wrote a chapter in a book called Troubled Persons Industries that was about this relationship, and it was kind of an outgrowth from our medicalization of marijuana book, which really looked at general medicalization issues, medical cannabis patients in the emerging system in Colorado. And what we realized was several people in there were reporting sort of off-label use for mental health issues. And so we wanted to explore that more, and yet once you dug into the psychiatry literature, it was kind of shocking sort of what that literature looks like. So we'll switch over to psychiatry for a moment, and it only takes a quick search of Google to realize that everybody from Columbia University to CDC to Psychology Today, mainstream psychology magazines, have a lot to say about how risky it is to use cannabis, not just for your mental health, but to use it for any reason because it will affect your mental health. And so I think I will. Should I go in or you want?
Sure.
So one of the things we realize that we talk about in the medicalization of marijuana as well is that it helps to think about what are patient accounts versus clinical assessments. How do lay people use information, use evidence, make decisions? By what logic do you decide, maybe I'll try that, maybe it will help me? Versus how do people who are in a professional position make decisions about whether something is efficacious or not, right? Whether it works or not. And so there are different standards of evidence for these two groups. And we know that lay people really are, another way to think about this is to think about it in a social science theory that talks about the system and the life world. So the system being the organizational structures that structure our society. Things like medicine, things like our criminal justice system, things like the economy. These are large-scale systemic organizations, and people work as organizational actors within these systems, carrying out the mission of that system, the mission of their organization. They usually have one role in that thing. Whereas the life world is where we all go home and take our shoes off and live our lives, right? It's where we have many roles, we have many relationships. It's where our, all of the rest of our life happens, right? Outside of work. So when we think about how people judge things in the life world, they think about things, and we found this in the medicalization of marijuana as well, that, they're trying to maximize quality of life. So they may not be as scientific about how they decide, but it may be something that they decide because other people talked about it and they thought, well, maybe that would work for me too. They may make that decision in the context of their relationships. Talk to your husband, wife, mother, children, whoever. What do you think? Should I try this? And they use it toward trying to function, to carry out day-to-day roles, right? So they care a lot about being able to keep their job, take their kids to school, be a functioning parent, be a functioning daughter, whatever it is. And a lot of times that involves controlling both the symptoms and the side effects of whatever you're using to treat the symptoms. So you end up thinking about both profiles, trying to balance that out to just have a functional, high quality of life. Whereas when we look at the system, what do system actors care about in the medical system? Well, they talk in terms of objective criteria, treatment success, keeping the ethics of their institution, meeting that, patient compliance with regimens. You know, how they measure success is not going to be so individual about how your quality of life is working. It's about whether your results are getting better or not, right? So they're going to think about those problems in different ways, and they're going to use different logics, and they're going to use different information, different sets of information to decide about whether that's a successful treatment or not. So here's the thing about cannabis use in mental health as a paradox, is that it really is a nexus of scientific uncertainty. Psychiatry readily admits, it's like an open secret, right, that they do not have the scientific information that they need to be able to define what goes wrong when you have various mental health problems. We simply don't know. There's a lot of work that gets done in order to try to understand this and explain this, but we don't have the answers. Likewise, with cannabis, we don't have the answer to how cannabis works. We don't have precise answers about these things. And when you have two things that are basically not scientifically explained, we don't have a clear and full answer to these things. A lot of times what stands in place of scientific certainty are categorizations. We figure out how to categorize and slice and dice and sort of create buckets that things fit in. And this has a practical purpose, because just because you don't know the answer doesn't mean you don't have to find solutions to the problems that people are facing. So it's a constructive thing in one sense, that when you have scientific uncertainty, you kind of have to work around it. But in this particular instance, where you have scientific uncertainty, it's kind of colluded together to use the categories of mental health and the very strong monopolized categorization of cannabis as one thing that is harmful over the last basically 100 years. And you kind of put those things together, and you get a lot of interpretive work that happens in between what gets collected as science and what the conclusions are from that. So in other words, those categorizations frame how people answer the questions that they ask. So from there, we're going to talk about that. How did psychiatry get to its interpretation? And for that, William's going to talk more about that.
Yeehaw. So we're going to do a little dive into history now, right? Because we are dealing today with a definition of the effects of cannabis, well established, psychotomimetic. It mimics psychosis. That is the definition of cannabis intoxication. It's been in the DSM every edition for 5 now, no change. We've changed a lot of definitions in there, a lot of diagnostic criteria have changed. That cannabis intoxication is a type of psychosis or a mimic of psychosis is a constant. Where did it come from? This guy. Jacques-Joseph Miraut, also known as Miraut de Tours, mid-19th century physician in France, early psychiatrist. This guy is recognized as the father of psychopharmacology. He was the first physician to theorize that mental states had to do with chemicals, and that you could take on board chemicals and induce mental changes. I mean, it's sort of like duh, but in that day, it was like Brave New World, right? He got this idea from traveling in Egypt with patients, because back in the day, they would go on traveling tours with rich patients to try to help them cure, and he saw hashish use, edible preparations in Egypt, and he started wondering about what those effects might be and whether there might be therapeutic potential. So he goes back to Paris with a lot of hash and starts making up his own concoctions. He becomes one of the founders of Club du Hachines, famous in literary circles for French artists and writers, who would get together and they would basically cosplay at what they called Orientalism, right? You know, so they would wear the clothes and do the music and do the food, and they would take incredible doses of edible hashish preparations. We don't know exactly, right? Because back then we have no idea what the potency was, but it was hashish, so already a concentrate. I've done some rough calculations because he was a careful scientist. He recorded all the amounts he gave himself, because this was the era of self-experimentation. Part of his idea was, I can go on a journey of psychosis and come back and report on it, right? How much? If we assume 4% THC hashish preparations, 700 milligrams of THC to 2,000 milligrams of THC per shot.
God.
Exactly. You're going to have an experience, right?
You're gonna see God.
You may well indeed. And you are certainly probably going to experience some depersonalization. You may get visual hallucinations. You can see sound, right? And so he chronicles his own experiences, chronicles the experiences of his patients, and this becomes the foundation for his book, which we translate as Hashish and Mental Illness. And this lays out the case for this connection. This is foundational. This is still cited in psychiatric literature today. I mean, articles being published today say, well, we've known since Moreau this connection between cannabis intoxication and psychosis. Interestingly, there was a sort of replication study in the early 1950s. Frances Ames in South Africa decided she was going to get 9 residents together. They prepared some oral preparations, and at work consumed also extremely high doses and basically got similar effects of feeling like they were going crazy. Novices, right? No experience using cannabis, very high doses, and at work. Maybe not the best idea. But this is what set the foundation for all of what was to follow. Okay, well, I'm going to say a little bit more about that then. Yeah, go ahead and go. So, you know, he does not end up being all that influential at the time, right? I mean, the book did not make a big name for himself. He, again, was established as one of the leading psychiatric doctors, but only in more recent years, because what comes between psychopharmacology of the 1950s, when we really start doing drug psychiatry, but of course Freud psychoanalysis is in there for a while. It wasn't until we get to the 1950s and the accidental discovery that fabric dyes have interesting psychological effects on people, and antihistamine. So these were the early drugs, blockbuster drugs in the US that changed the landscape of how psychiatry worked. And all of a sudden there was an embrace of this kind of biophysical model for psychosis and other mental health problems. And again, this connects back to Moreau. So big intervening time, but we end up back to a drug-based approach to things. These were all incredible drugs. We have a very consistent pattern in terms of how they were presented. These are miracle cures. They fix everything. There's no side effects, completely safe, don't worry about it. We prescribe it to a few million people who use it for a while, and it's like, oh gosh, people are getting dependent, and we're getting some really strange side effects. And the drug gets pulled, and the next one comes along, right? Through all of these, zero idea about the mechanism of action. So we understand the chemistry of these drugs for the most part, but no idea what's actually happening when you put them in your body. So what psychiatrists are looking at is simply the net effect, right? So we're going to switch to back to our doctors and laypersons here a little bit. So one of the things that happens with cannabis, so cannabis is treated differently, right? So similar kind of black box idea, but we don't have understandings of how it interacts in the same way that we do some other things, or at least doctors don't think so, because it's not an approved medication. And so there tends to be a split here between the way doctors and lay people think about it, as we've already talked about. One of the problems that we run into with doctors is that they just simply don't support the use of cannabis, in the same way the general public does. 80 to 90% of people in the United States say that cannabis should be a legal option for medical treatment. Fewer than half of doctors think so. And doctors, generally speaking, are not comfortable talking about it because they have zero training in it. At this point, only 9% of medical schools offer any training in cannabis as a potential therapeutic avenue for anything. And most of them report that they're not prepared to even answer questions about CBD and THC. Majority of psychiatrists in Australia said they don't know the difference between the two of them. So this is just an area that they're not really comfortable talking about. So okay.
So now we're going to talk about the case study, the one that we hear so much about actually in the news, and that has to do with psychosis and specifically schizophrenia. And a lot of the articles out there basically treat it as a given, an already known thing. Cannabis causes schizophrenia. You'll see it over and over and over again, written or paraphrased in this way. One interesting thing about schizophrenia is that the global rates of schizophrenia have stayed the same, and they are the same across countries that have very different cannabis use rates. So what is going on with this claim that if more people use more cannabis, we should see more schizophrenia, right? If it's causing it, the rates should go up in countries that are using it more than in the countries that use it very little, if at all. The rates should go up over time if we weren't using it as a culture at all, and now policies have changed it so that the rates of use are going way up. Well, when we look into this, one interesting thing is that the number of articles are going up about cannabis and schizophrenia or cannabis and psychosis. So
but what is connected to is not emerging science or new clinical findings. What we see here, 1967 to 1977, right? So this is the emergence of the popularization of cannabis. More and more people are using it. And so there is an uptick of interest, but you can still see, here's 50 articles a year. So, we get to a maximum of about 25 until we get to the introduction of medical cannabis. And we get a few years in, and all of a sudden the interest starts skyrocketing. And here is where we get the first adult use. And now we're at a consistent rate, 150 to 200 articles a year, all making a case of a connection between cannabis and psychosis. What's the basis for this? Population studies. So we do survey collecting, we ask people about their cannabis use, we ask them about mental health diagnoses, we connect the two. And yes, in fact, there is a very strong association between the two.
Yeah.
So we have 4 major findings from the literature that we're seeing the chart for. High rates of cannabis use among people with mental health diagnoses, particularly schizophrenia. We're going to mostly focus on that right here. Depending on the study, somewhere between 5 times more likely to be an enthusiastic cannabis user to 13 times more likely to be an enthusiastic cannabis user than the general population. So also the strong association between cannabis use and a subsequent diagnosis is how we get to the causality claim. Because as the old saying goes, correlation is not causation. But when we see a temporal relationship in a correlation, then it looks more compelling. If we consistently find the thing that correlates happening before the second thing, it's like, well, probably that's causing it. Again, we don't really know for sure because it's just this, correlation thing. However, one of the things this overlooks is life course, as the sociologist would talk about. There is a typical age of initiation for cannabis use. There is a typical age at which people get a diagnosis of a psychotic disorder. they are different. One precedes the other. Most cannabis use initiates in adolescence, teenage years. Psychosis diagnosis, schizophrenia diagnoses typically are young adult. Peak at about age 40, 25 being the median. So it is not surprising that one would precede the other. There is also a dose-response effect that is found. In other words, people with these diagnoses tend to be more enthusiastic users. They're not just more likely, but they're using a lot of cannabis. This is not unlike other substances. Schizophrenics are typically, many of them, chain smokers. They're using many substances to try to self-manage various things for a variety of reasons. So not different from other things. And then lastly, they point to the transient psychotic-like symptoms in experimental studies. Remember Moreau? Right? So we've been able to replicate similar things in laboratories with volunteers where we inject IV THC. For reasons we're not entirely sure of, even though it looks like we're getting a blood level that's the same, considerably more psychoactive. And so we see results in these IV experiments that look nothing like any other consumption mode. And of course, you know, how many IV THC users do you know, right? So to make claims about what people do normally, quote unquote, with cannabis, based on this is a little questionable.
But then we can think about, well, what do people with schizophrenia say about their cannabis use? And individuals with schizophrenia and studies that ask them to report on this consistently report that cannabis helps with negative symptoms. So you can talk a little bit about positive and negative symptoms in schizophrenia.
So schizophrenia typically, again, positive, negative. Positive are the florid ones that sort of mark it in terms of hearing voices, hallucinations. These are not the symptoms that typically are the most debilitating. It is the negative symptoms, which are depression, anxiety, and problems with sociability. Those are what cause life problems for folks with schizophrenia. And in the panoply of pharmacological options that psychiatrists have, negative symptoms they've got nothing for. They've got a few drugs that do fairly well with the positive symptoms, but what patients report is that the cannabis helps with the negative symptoms. This is consistent with what other folks say. Again, depression, anxiety, and general, able to get along in life. We also have new reports coming out in in very recent days. So again, thinking about this history and this uncertainty, we only discovered the endocannabinoid system in the 1990s, right? Yeah. So these new links to the endocannabinoid system indicate that there may be some connections here with ECS activation to managing schizophrenia that matches some of the reports of people. One case study, very interesting in New York, with what they call refractory schizophrenics, not responding at all to any treatment options, but it reported using cannabis effectively. The doctor's like, okay, well, let's try it. And they were all discharged. They were able to go back to living independently using cannabis as a treatment option. So case study, but nonetheless.
So in looking at the literature and the research here, we're finding that some of the things that are grounding this certainty that cannabis causes schizophrenia are kind of sitting on some shaky ground, scientifically speaking, in terms of what did they use to come to that conclusion. And there's a lot of there's an interpretive gap here between the ambiguity of the data that's collected and the certainty of the conclusions that are put out there. And so even the ones that we feel sort of have the most unified opinions being expressed out there, there's still some questions about whether or not there's still a lot of uncertainty in this thing that isn't being expressed. So Jim Hudson is this researcher guy who has a health consultancy firm, and the name of it is Health, Health, That's his thing. If you ever want to look at his website, it's just hellth.com. And he says that modern health research is expensive, right? It's really expensive to do modern health research. So, in general, research doesn't happen unless there's enough funding to pay for it. So, if we look at what's being funded, that's a good place to start to understand what's going on. So this is the data that he collected, with over $1 billion being spent on cannabis research in the last 2 decades. Who spends that money? Where does that money go? One place mostly, the National Institutes of Health. Now, this is it's a federal umbrella institution that contains all of the other institutes that do research, and then they're all under the umbrella of National Institute of Health. So he digs down a little bit further. So we see that here they spent about $1.4 billion on cannabis research over this time, distantly followed by the Department of Defense spending about $12.5 million. Colorado's Department of Public Health and Environment, $9 million, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, about $1.5 million. Okay.
What was that first largest category again? Sorry.
Yeah. Here,
Yes.
this is the National Institutes of Health.
Okay, cool.
And so then when we break down the National Institutes of Health even further to the institutes inside of that umbrella institution, where's all the money? I feel like this just looks kind of like a big FU in the middle. But it's NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse. Well, why does this matter? We know as a Schedule I drug, there are all kinds of complications to doing research with cannabis, and we won't go on that side tangent right now. But, it matters because the NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse, it's right in their name. What do they study? Drug abuse. Abuse. They study drug abuse. They do not study health effects from drugs. That is not their mission. That goes under other institutes. So who's studying cannabis? Only the institute that studies abuse of drugs. So, this is the lay of the land. This goes up to about 2018, so we're a little bit ahead of that. But it is important to think about how this funding mechanism affects the research that was done and who received, who could pay their bills on doing that research, and what kind of research that's going to create as outcomes, and then what that's going to mean when you go and look at that research literature and try to say, well, what does most of the literature say? It's going to be pulled in a direction by this funding. So we're kind of back to lay people and doctors again, this system and life world. As William said, doctors are not educated in health benefits. Only 9% of our U.S. medical schools do any discussion of cannabis as a potential treatment. And but the other thing that we want to go back to here, when we see this skew, the skew is not that people aren't doing science, right? It's actually a great sociological question to think about how the whole literature is skewed. Not because any one individual had some bad intent here. They probably all did, the best science according to the scientific method, asked a good question, but you have to wonder what questions did not get asked, right? It's about what questions you can ask and what questions you cannot ask. And this limits all of this past research, decades of research, to sort of one side of the equation.
And methodology here too, right?
Right.
Back to our IV experimental, drug studies with THC versus more naturalistic setting, and trying to look at what people are actually doing in their lives.
Yeah, and so I like to circle it back. This is a thing that I'm particularly interested in. I'm very interested in sociology of science and these types of things, and so I think it becomes very interesting when we think back to this nexus of scientific uncertainty, right? And so I would argue that cannabis over this entire period of time up till the 1990s has been in a period that did not have, it had a non-scientific paradigm. In other words, we didn't have certainty about how it works, so we didn't have any science. So Bruno Latour, this famous sociologist of science, says, you know, we can call that a black box, right? And the thing about a black box is you can do science around a black box. You just say whatever's in here, we don't need to know that. We can measure the inputs and we can measure the outputs without knowing what's here. And I will point you back to the thing I was saying about there's a certain amount of practicality about this. Because you're going to have things you don't know. It doesn't mean you don't need practical answers to things. So you just put it in a black box, you work around it. You look at the inputs, you look at the outputs. And in fact, that is pretty much, you can look at the last 20 years of research and what were they looking at. A lot of it is looking at, you know, it's looking at questions about the inputs. What led somebody to use cannabis? How did they use it and so forth? And it's looking at the outputs. And because it was NIDA, what terrible things happened to them because they did, right? So that was a lot of what we get out of that research. Now there is some research that begins to be about foundational things, but even Meshulam said, Raphael Meshulam, our grandfather of cannabis research, he worked for over 50 years doing foundational research from the first mapping and positive identification of THC as the active element in cannabis, all the way up until his death last year, and where he's doing all kinds of crazy, interesting stuff with an entire team in Israel. But even at the time, he, people said, why are you researching this? This isn't an important question, you know? So it's not just what gets funded, but it's also pressures of your profession, you know, to ask questions that people feel are important and valuable to answer as a society. And you know, if we think about that as, you know, this being a bracketed part of actually how does it function in the body, well, we didn't know. If you look at descriptions up to the 1990s, you basically get these descriptions that sound like something from a century ago. They're like, well, some diffuse action, maybe something in the bloodstream. You know, that was basically about as far as we had managed to describe it. But when we come to the 1990s, we get to open the black box, right? Because now we've discovered some foundational things that actually allow us to begin a scientific paradigm in this area. They allow us to start the building blocks of a paradigm that's based in science. And that is the endocannabinoid system. And, you know, the first discoveries from this in the late 1980s, they continued into the 1990s, but we're still identifying all the components, how they operate in the body, how they affect other systems. There's a million questions about this still to answer. And
we're only just beginning, right? I mean, so identifying cannabinoid receptors, identifying where they are, beginning to identify some of the ways in which the chemicals in cannabis operate on them, you know, that's a starting point. But by no means do we have really clear answers. But we have some promising indications because we have, again, this emerging science still back in this, you know, biophysical model of what's happening in the brain, that some of the problems may be related to inflammation of the brain. They may be related to oxidation. They may be related to immune response. Each of those three things are modulated by cannabinoids. Your endogenous cannabinoid system works on these systems. Phytocannabinoids and synthetic cannabinoids operate on them as well. So there is significant potential here, yet to be really explored, that may show some real promise here. One of the things that we are starting to see, I mean, so that's kind of like real basic science stuff, but we're doing better about naturalistic science with people who are actually using cannabis. CU Boulder, shout out to these two on that. is doing some work where they have a mobile lab that goes around to people's houses, because as you all know, can't bring cannabis on campus, can't do something here unless you got a Schedule I license. But you can go to them. So they allow people to use the cannabis they would normally use, either vaping or an edible. They do an assessment in the mobile van out front. They get to go inside, they do whatever they're going to do. They come back out, they measure blood levels, and they reassess. They have also done some things where they look at, for instance, depression and personality types and say, well, we've got certain characteristics that we know correlate to an increased incidence of depression and anxiety. There's some indications that cannabis can help with that. Let's track a cohort of people over a couple of years. Lo and behold, in fact, the marijuana use, as they call it, cannabis use, decreased depression and anxiety for those groups significantly over the 2 years. So we're getting somewhere, but that's 2 studies, right? And if we think back to that, couple thousand of articles, I have not looked at every article in every one of those years, but in 2020, of the 167 articles, there were 4 that considered any therapeutic benefit, and 3 of those were CBD. So CBD is one of the chemicals in cannabis that looks super promising. Meshulam, like 30 years ago, identified antipsychotic effects for CBD. And we were at a conference in Denver not all that long ago where he was like, where is the research on this? We know that there's some potential, but nobody is investigating it. The side effect profile for CBD, so much better than all the other antipsychotics that are out there. Relatively high doses, we're talking like 600 milligrams of CBD. But even that is safe. That's similar to the Epidiolex doses that we give kids with seizure disorders.
So we're sharing with you this great interest we have in this question and that we've been delving into for the last few years. And we've been spending time looking at each DSM category, looking at anxiety and depression, looking at neurological disorders, looking at the new research on autism, because that's also in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual from Psychiatry, looking at schizophrenia and psychosis, looking at these various conditions, looking at the research as it exists in cannabis, and we can see that there is this skew, there's this problem. And I would say our boldest claim that I would give you tonight is that claims to mental health harms are the last linchpin in the drug war. As long as claims that aren't based on evidence but interpretation are allowed to stand, to not only say you can't use it for mental health, but you can't use it for other things because it will negatively affect your mental health, is sort of the last thing that they're standing on to hold on to these claims of the drug war.
It's also the source of a lot of stigma. So we've done some work on stigma. Chapter in the Routledge Handbook deals with legitimacy strategies patients use to combat stigma. But mental health is a stigmatized condition. Cannabis use is a stigmatized condition. You combine the two and you've got a significant problem for a lot of people. And the types of ways that structural stigma can work, so not necessarily somebody who's prejudiced against it, but just we've got rules of systems about what the effects of cannabis are, right? Second Amendment stuff, right? The courts have said you're not entitled to own a weapon if you're a medical cannabis user because foundationally, drug users are unreliable individuals. They act crazy. And as we've got the little citation here, Dr. Carl Hart, who's done some fantastic work on all types of drug stuff, his claim is that this is really what lies behind a lot of police violence too, right? Is that if you're on drugs, you're inherently dangerous, and I am justified in using whatever kind of force necessary because you're no longer a normal human being, right? So it's everything from being denied a job, being denied the right to own a firearm, to losing your life that comes from this connection. So the consequences are significant. And separating some of this stuff out in a rational way is going to be important for moving public policy forward, moving research forward.
And I would say, we need more research. We need people to be cannabis studies majors or minors and to understand these topics because there are literally hundreds of research questions that need to be answered. And I would ask you to consider this idea that there is a non-scientific paradigm of the past that many people are clinging to, but it's not based in science. And there is an emerging scientific-based paradigm that we can help to fill in some of these gaps and really better understand this in a more balanced way. And so clinical research is needed, but this kind of social research that looks at cannabis use and framing in context is also super, super important to understanding this issue. So I hope you'll carry forward that idea of paradigm when you think about how different literature is being presented to you, and think about, is this old paradigm? Is this new paradigm? Because I think it helps to explain a lot of the paradox we see of the information that is presented. So, thank you for giving us your time tonight. Thank you for listening.
We had a couple of questions.
Yeah, I wanted to look at the questions we have in our.
But let's also maybe make a stack of people in the room that might want to ask a question.
Stack like get in the back or what?
No, just let me count it off.
Oh.
1,
I think there
2.
was some on there's a bunch on here too.
Yeah, we'll while you guys are pulling that up.
Yeah, we can.
Yeah,
put
let's
that
go
on
with
the
the first
screen as
question.
well, but-
So
Yes,
is
please.
it possible, and this maybe go without saying, but is it possible that the bias against cannabis by the psychiatrists and that institution, maybe because they can't make money off of prescribing it?
Well, I think
Okay, so let's be clear here, right? I mean, part of the paradox here and part of the real challenge is we're talking about good people who are trying to do good in the world and are trying to be serious and careful, right? So when we think about the impact of funding and money and careerism, right? I mean, these are influences that are operating in the background on some level, right? So, you know, you have to acknowledge that those are pressures that are influencing the path, right? So it's less an individual thing on some level about, you know, the cash money side of things. The consideration of it as a pharmacological agent is almost certainly influenced by the inability of pharmaceutical companies to make much money on it effectively. GW Pharmaceuticals has a couple of drugs that are plant-derived. Epidiolex is available by prescription in the United States. Sativex is available in many countries, was denied approval here in the US. But what they could patent was the delivery device, not the actual substance. And those blockbuster drugs of the 50s are because you've got a patentable drug that you can set the price on and sell exclusively for a few decades.
That's why I was asking, because Xanax has
Yeah.
terrible side effects and it actually kills people who are trying to get off of it.
Yeah.
Cannabis doesn't.
Right.
So I'm wondering what that black box you're talking about seems to be applied to those drugs as well.
it does.
100%,
It does.
and we do not understand the mechanism of action. I mean, even SSRIs, right? I mean, we had a story for a while that selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors were solving a chemical imbalance in the brain. You've got a serotonin
How many people
problem.
saw that kind of ad that would say it's solving a chemical imbalance? Anybody familiar with that? Yeah.
Relatively common.
It was
Completely
common in the
disproven.
marketing.
No such thing.
Completely
No such
disproven.
thing, yeah.
Serotonin has no relationship to depression. So now the story is, well, we don't understand what the SSRIs are doing, but they seem to be effective. They're an important drug, so we're going to keep prescribing them.
We don't mind the increased risk of suicide.
Yeah, and,
Right.
and it is interesting though how we have what we call cannabis exceptionalism, right? When the comparison is unfavorable to cannabis, we love to throw cannabis in there. When it might be favorable or make it like other things, we leave it out, and we treat it separately. We treat it differently. I mean, if you really put cannabis up, and lots of advocacy organizations and so forth have done this repeatedly in their own, marketing materials. But just if you put up the side effects and the potential dangers as they're understood next to some of these other things that you can use, whether it's other recreational drugs or other medicines, that it's clear that we don't that the profile is way safer.
Way safer. I got a couple of questions.
let's take the second one in the room real quick, and
Okay.
then to those.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, this was just a follow-up to a question I asked
Yeah.
earlier in regards to the recording of this meeting. People informed me very graciously that it was being recorded. Where is it going though? Like, where do I find it?
CannabisStudiesLab.com.
CannabisStudiesLab.com.
There's
Okay.
also YouTube.
So,
Oh, excellent. Is it just CannabisStudiesLab.com at YouTube?
Yeah, basically, just Cannabis Studies Lab.
Okay, thank you
so
very
we
much.
have a question about the causational relationship between cannabis and schizophrenia and what the claim is. Is this a permanent thing? And the answer is yes. You know, schizophrenia is not a temporary thing. There is in the DSM a temporary cannabis psychosis. So this is simply a condition in which you've gotten high, and those
Super high.
conditions,
Yeah.
I mean, you're significantly high, and it doesn't go away in the normal time frame. So instead of lasting a few hours, it's now going to last a day, 2 days, maybe a week, and then it resolves. There's never any treatment involved with this, right? Reassurance is the treatment for problems like that. The connection to schizophrenia, they do not have cases where they can say, the guy smoked a joint and he went crazy and he's schizophrenic now. That's not the claim. It's that we see people who use cannabis also have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And they are sometimes using it while they are symptomatic. And again, they explain, we do have qualitative research asking them why, and they say it is to manage those negative symptoms, the same as other folks. The other question related to that was, if you're using cannabis to self-manage that, can you end up in a dependency problem, right? Cannabis use dependency is one of the diagnoses in the DSM. It strongly correlates to mental health issues. In some sense, no surprise. And there are significant problems in our view with some of the diagnostic criteria used to identify cannabis use disorder, because you can basically combine them in about 2,000 different ways and come up with the diagnosis. They dropped the legal problems criteria with the DSM-5, but as the DSM-4, getting into trouble with the law was one of the diagnostic check marks to be diagnosed with CUD. So it's just like you got busted, right?
Another
And
interesting thing about cannabis use disorder is that a lot of people who are taken under managed care for mental health, all they have to do is say they used cannabis, and they do get a secondary diagnosis of cannabis use disorder
yeah, we've
with
interviewed
very little additional information about their actual cannabis use. So again, that's like thinking about when people are integrated into an institution that's meant to help people with problems. This becomes a label that gets put on people very readily in those situations.
And because the connection is so clear and long-standing within psychiatry, there is a tendency, at least among some psychiatric professionals, to say, aha, you're a cannabis user. I understand exactly what's going on,
Yeah.
right? And the other thing I want to say about the CUD diagnosis, though, any medical user is vulnerable to a CUD diagnosis because you're a consistent user.
Yeah.
And that's one of the criteria. If you are being given a prescribed medication, that excludes several of the criteria. But that is not the case for cannabis because it is not a legal prescribed medication. So you can have a dependence on opioids, and if it's prescribed, you don't get a dependence diagnosis. But with cannabis, you will. So.
Well, it's right on 7 o'clock, so I want to respect your time, and I really thank you all for coming out. It's such a pleasure to be here in person, so please do come up and introduce yourselves, especially if you've taken a class or you're planning to take a class, interested in taking a class. If you couldn't guess, we could talk about this stuff all night. But I do
Michelle,
believe there's some...
Well, just a quick
Yeah.
suggestion, if folks have questions they weren't able to ask, how can they best reach you?
Oh, yeah.
No.
Well, you have,
Well, you can
Humboldt
take my
faculty
global
affiliation,
cannabis class
right?
next semester. That's an awesome way to get in touch with me. We're both in the directory
You're,
for
Humboldt.
Humboldt.
okay.
If you're a non-student and you do have a question that you asked but wasn't addressed, can we just chat with you afterwards?
Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely. Happy to give you contact
And then you must say
information.
something